Hello, and thank you to everyone joining us for today's webinar on the RAIN 2022 Annual Forecast. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's presentation. Matthew Bay is RAIN's Senior Analyst, where he focuses on cyber risk management for organizations across various sectors. He also covers a wide range of topics in international relations. Matthew has focused heavily on geopolitical, political, economic, and security issues in the Middle East and Africa.
So I will be going over two topics. The first one is going to be looking at how ransomware attacks, which have really grown over the last year and a half or so since the pandemic began, how we are expecting, the financially motivated cyber attacks to evolve in 2022. And then it's somewhat connected to at least some of the threats that we're seeing. But I'll also talk about the U.S.-Iran negotiations because there is a potential for an escalation that could include cyber activities that is directed at U.S. organizations as well. But first of all, so since we did see a growth of ransomware attacks over the last year, of course, we had a couple of very high-profile attacks. There was the Colonial Pipeline hack in May of 2021. That was followed up with an attack against JBS, the meat company, as well as one against an IT management software company that then affected a lot of its customers. All of those attacks really did force the United States to get very aggressive and starting to target these ransomware groups that are largely based in Eastern Europe or Russia, and trying to disrupt or reduce the number of attacks that we've seen. While we did see a lull in attacks over the summer, we have seen the number of at least reported incidents of leaks happening on the dark web, so i.e. A person that's being hacked that then does not pay a ransom and then their data is leaked. We've seen that actually go up month over month, every single month in the second half of the year, suggesting that perhaps the U.S. Pressure campaign, which has included a myriad of different things, hasn't really been all that successful in reducing the number of attacks, even if it has maybe not led to, or at least has helped stop another very significant attack on the scale of the Colonial Pipeline hack. We do not anticipate the U.S. strategy to be effective in reducing substantially the risk of ransomware attacks on U.S. organizations. However, we do think that there are essentially a couple of shifts that it will cause in terms of changing the calculus that ransomware groups do when they carry out their attacks. For example, one thing that we anticipate is that some of your larger operations that had been previously going after, say, an oil pipeline, it's clear that they didn't really intend to disrupt the pipeline, and it really isn't. It became clear that really even the Russian government, which sort of does have a relationship with some of these groups, didn't want something to be that disruptive. So we do anticipate at least some of those groups recalibrating the types of attacks they're doing. One, to get outside of the pressure from the Kremlin, who is going after these groups, saying, "Do not screw up our relationship with the U.S. too much. We want you to continue some of the activities, but not really disrupting critical infrastructure." And also the U.S. aggressive campaign, which does include sanctions. It also includes offensive cyber operations to disrupt their ransomware group servers. If they do not, carry out those attacks that are very disruptive, they're less likely to have U.S. suspicion to go against them. So that's something else that will be shifting. But it doesn't mean that a lot of your smaller and medium-sized ransomware operations, or at least your less large scale in the sense of demanding billion or millions of dollars, are really going to change their behavior. They're still going to be targeting a lot of U.S. medium-sized and large-sized organizations. That's going to include government targets. It's going to include commercial targets, etc. So we do anticipate that to continue deep into next year, and really, quite frankly, for the foreseeable future. However, another thing, though, that we do think this is going to cause is potentially more governments, whether it's in the U.S. at the federal level or the U.S. at the state level or internationally for that matter, putting into place more stringent requirements around payments for ransoms. And this can also include through policies that are going to be done by cyber insurance providers. And that can put companies and organizations in a bind if, for whatever reason, either a government regulation or the fact that they may not have ransomware insurance, that can put them in a position where they can't pay the ransom. Either for example, it could be that the group that was targeted or that did carry out the operation is somebody that was placed on the U.S. sanctions lists. And then a company will have to evaluate whether or not it's worth, bringing up the potential fines and violations that that come with paying that ransom, versus a massive disruption in their operations. And we do think that the small and medium-sized companies, the ones that don't have the ability to really make rents or pay fines to a large degree or survive for a very significant period without their services, those are the companies that are going to be affected the most. Now, what we also anticipate is a shift, or at least a gradual shift, in the targeting selection by some of your ransomware groups. While the U.S. has put into place some of these countermeasures for ransomware, and also has just boosted up since the May 2020 cybersecurity executive order has also just boosted up the U.S. cyber defenses, we are likely to see what really has been a North American-centric plague that is ransomware, see that spread pretty significantly more in Europe. Of course, we already know that European infections are occurring. There's a number of cases that have happened over the last couple of years, but we expect that to growth in terms of the percent accelerating in growth and its growth to the point where it's not quite to the U.S. level, but it is dramatically where we're seeing the biggest increase. And we could also conceivably see that even outside of Europe, targeting organizations in, say, South Asia, Southeast Asia, et cetera, where they might find some success, for example, because you don't necessarily have the same level of cyber hygiene that you have, say, in the EU or US, with cracked software, pirated software, et cetera, pretty rampant in a lot of those countries. And that just already means that there's existent malware, et cetera, that is already present on a lot of systems. So we do anticipate that. Now, another thing to be thinking about, and I think this is where it connects more with Iran and also North Korea for that matter, is that we do expect a higher percentage of attacks coming from Iran and North Korea that are ransomware type attacks. And what I mean by that is that in the case of North Korea has, of course, had a very long history of financially motivated cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks for that matter, that are designed to get around U.S. sanctions, raise money for the intelligence services within North Korea, et cetera. They're seeing a lot of success right now from the Russia-based or Eastern European-based ransomware groups when it comes to leveraging companies with multiple different types of extortion and getting paid. So for them, that is something that we expect them to start to adopt and model and basically try to expand their operations to raise money that way. In the case of Iran, we've already seen several Iranian groups starting to do more ransomware attacks over the last year or so, targeting not only the US, but also, of course, Israel. But what's been interesting on that is we've seen a couple of groups doing things that are essentially ransomware attacks without the ransom. So they're basically just encrypting their victims' data. There has been cases where one group in Israel, for example, or one group that is targeting Israel, for example, has decided just to disrupt and encrypt a victim as a part of a political statement going against the Israeli organization. Now, is this directly connected to the Iranian government? Unclear. But the point is that the Iranian actors, who will probably have a much higher tolerance for risk when it comes to some of their cyber attacks, we could see them starting to use encryption and just disruption through ransomware, either with or without a ransom, as a way to push back against Israel and the US in a much more significant fashion, especially if talks with the US break down on the nuclear issue and the US and Israel respond by, for example, increasing covert activity that is designed to disrupt and destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. There's a long history of the U.S. using cyber attacks the U.S. and Israel using cyber attacks in that, of course, with this Stuxnet virus from a decade ago. But as the U.S. and Israel consider those options, that's going to force Iran to consider those similar options. And then moving on to the U.S.-Iran issue itself, we do anticipate that there will likely be some sort of a limited deal sometime this year. But I want to stress that even a limited deal has a ton of risks. For example, we do not anticipate the negotiations to be going very smooth, which means that Iran will be maintaining its very aggressive regional strategy against different entities. That will include, for example, a potential attack on a tanker in the Middle East, or potentially an occasional attack on an Israeli container vessel that's going through, say, the Strait of Hormuz. All of those risks are going to be present throughout the year. Even if a deal, not all of those are necessarily going to go away. For example, the Israel-Iran shadow war might still be something that continues after a deal, even if Iran doesn't necessarily want to start, harassing the U.S. at an increased pace. That being said, why we do anticipate a deal, we are at kind of a precipice when it comes to the negotiations. If we do not see progress over the next, say, 6 to 8 weeks, Iran's nuclear program is getting to a point where it's very concerning to the U.S. and particularly Israel, which means that negotiations may only have a shelf life to at least have some progress over the next 2 months. And there is a very realistic chance that the negotiations actually break down. The U.S. doesn't have and Israel, of course, has even less, doesn't have a ton of patience right now when we are seeing Iran, its nuclear stockpiling and its enrichment going to higher levels than we've seen in a very long time. Those are all very concerning to the point where if we are sitting here in, say, August or September and there's no deal on the table, Iran hasn't offered any significant concessions, negotiations might fall out entirely and both sides might escalate, leading us to one of those scenarios for some of those disruptive cyber attacks, not to mention other things, could be more of a risk that U.S. organizations have to face.
Thank you to all our attendees for listening in today. If you do have any further questions for any of our analysts on the line, please do reach out to RAIN for an introduction. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.